Well met, travellers, Halsin called, approaching the camp with a lanky drow woman shading her eyes by his side. I trust you're all well rested? Good morning, Halsin. Simon smiled, meeting him at the trail into camp with an expression of polite interest. And who's this? He asked, taking the drow in more fully. Her amethyst eyes glittered with a hint of mischief as she stared back at Simon. Her wavy silver hair fell halfway down her back, and set on her brow was the circlet of branches Simon had returned to Roth earlier that morning in shame. This is Nettie, Halsin said, gesturing to her. Made anew by the Oak Father's grace. Nettie? What? Simon sputtered, eyes wide as he looked between Nettie's new elven form and Halsin, his placid smile unwavering. Before, Simon had the power to raise the dead after nearly a 10-day on his best days in the temple, but to create a new body entirely. I believe we've met before, she said, holding her hand out to shake. Twice. Glad to see we both made it back from the long wait in the fugue plane. Yes, Simon stammered, accepting her hand. The skin of her hands, though it couldn't be more than a few hours old, already held the calluses of a woman who had spent years living and working in the wilds, toughened against stinging nettles and thorny branches. The body was new, but crafted perfectly for a druid of her station. Incredible. Also glad to see your face is intact, she added, making a gesture alluding to tentacles. She leaned close, squinting up at him in the sunlight. Though she was much taller than she was as a dwarf, she was still more than a head shorter than Simon. Still look tired round the eyes, though. Well, we did celebrate the defeat of the goblins long into the night, he said, catching sight of Astarion as he sauntered through camp, proud as a peacock. Simon cleared his throat and turned back to the druids. I do apologize for that whole business between you and I. Say what you mean, Nettie instructed, crossing her arms. None of that city talk. Simon sighed but nodded. I apologize that our confrontation cost us both our lives. I recall you saying that we were both simply trying to protect the ones we love, and that is certainly the case. I'm sorry that each of us doing the right thing set us at odds, and had such a dear price. Apology accepted, Nettie nodded, smiling. And I thank you for bringing Master Halsin back to us. As you can see, he's a fair hand at healing, she said, gesturing to herself. When I spoke to Ralph on my own this morning, he said Halsin would bring you back, but I'd assumed it would be in the same body, Simon remarked, looking between the two of them. When we die, we commit our bodies back to nature, Halsin said. Oakfather willing, if we are to return to life, we do so in bodies made anew, with his blessing. Although what that new body looks like is always a bit up in the air. Still, we mustn't judge a gift. Aye, it'll take some getting used to, but I can always wear a hat, Nettie said, raising a hand to shield her eyes from the sunlight again. Well, Nettie, I hate to come back only to leave again so soon, but we have a chance to cut out the rot that is spreading these parasites, Halsin said, turning to Nettie. I trust the infirmary to you once more, and leadership to the three. Please keep an eye on Korga. She, too, thought she was acting in everyone's best interests, but the Hell's favorite gilding is good intentions. Yes, Master Halsin. Best of luck. Oakfather preserve you. Nettie nodded, turning and walking back down the path towards the grove before transforming into a falcon and taking to the air with a cheering shriek. Now, Halsin smiled down at Simon, it's time to have that discussion you were so keen on last night. How are we all getting to Moonrise? Day 9. What a 10-day it's been. Not only have we so far outlasted the longest expected prognosis for Ceramorphosis with no onset of symptoms, but we've routed the army of the Absolute and her commanders. Well, this company anyway. The documents and maps I claimed from Minthara's desk show much greater numbers at Moonrise Towers, the seat of the cult of the Absolute's power. With this news, the refugee caravan is departing for the Risen Road, passing by Rosymorn Monastery and on to Baldur's Gate. Assuming they pass the Githyanki Creche, which apparently lies there, without incident, and move quickly through the shadow-cursed lands, they will be at the gate a 10 day hence. We've begun disassembling our camp as well. Gale's been performing some incredible spell work on some of the various trunks and chests we've found and traded for, expanding their interiors by considerable amounts and allowing us to pack all of the knickknacks and treasures we've found and take them on the road with us. As I understand it, he's also donated this service to the old woman handling the mess wagon for the caravan as well, which should at least alleviate one of the logistical complications of their journey. Famed writer, and something of a childhood hero of mine, Volothamp Gedon will be travelling with us, if you can believe it. He stated he intends to document the cult of the Absolute for his next book, and will follow us high and low through the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. Quite the vote of confidence from a man we rescued. He and Halsin, who will also accompany us, have both been giving the whispering earrings Gale and I developed to aid in communication on this journey. It is my hope that we will be on the road by noon, though it will be the last time we see the sun for a while. We've elected to travel via the Underdark to Moonrise Towers. Though it is a more dangerous path, it is a significant shortcut over taking the Risen Road. Halsin's apparently spent some time in the Underdark. He should prove an excellent guide. According to him, there's a secret entrance to the Underdark within the Temple of Selûne, where he himself exited the Underdark in his past treks there, so we're heading back inside. I'm sure the smell will be horrendous, but we must endure. Simon hadn't been wrong when he predicted the smell would be awful. Dozens upon dozens of goblins, bugbears, hobgoblins, wargs, gnolls, even a few ogres lay where they had fallen in their camp the day before. A few enterprising young tieflings were picking through the remains of the dead in search of any supplies that hadn't been claimed as spoils the evening before, cloth tied over their noses as they worked. The buzzards soaring overhead didn't seem to mind the stench, though some appeared too large to simply be birds, and Simon hurried his pace back into the desecrated temple, whistling for Scratch, who also seemed intensely interested in the variety of smells available, sniffing at each corpse they passed with his ears forward and tail wagging. Right, so if I were a secret passageway into the Underdark, where would I be? Karlach asked, looking around. It was deep inside the temple, but I'm afraid I don't recall the layout particularly well. It was so long ago I last used that passage, Halsin remarked. And clearly things have changed, he added, gesturing to collapsed walls and enormous crevasses in the floor. If it's the shortcut back to the absolute space of operations, Simon began, then it's likely somewhere where one of the true souls could keep an eye on it. We should search their chambers thoroughly. You didn't see anything the first time through? Will asked, peering around the bloodied sanctuary hall. We weren't looking for it before, Simon shrugged. Let's split up. Let everyone know if you find something, and don't get in over your heads. We'll be quite spread out, so use caution. Who's going with whom? Gale asked, looking to Simon. Oh, come now, you're not soldiers or children. We can group ourselves freely. I'll only insist that no one travels alone, Simon said, his gaze flicking to Shadowheart and Lae'zel, the most likely offenders. A few moments of muttering and discussion followed before three groups split, and for a long moment Simon wondered if he ought not to have assigned groups after all. Lae'zel and Shadowheart marched towards Guts Chapel, eyeing one another closely as Halsin and Scratch followed, moving up to keep space between the ladies. Will and Karlach followed Simon as he headed for Minthara's chambers, and Astarion seemed keen to leave Gale and Volo behind as they eagerly began chatting with one another, trailing far after him on the way towards the back of the temple as they pointed out various fixtures and damage with great enthusiasm. I'd say we've got the best group here, Karlach grinned, nudging Will playfully. Yeah, hope everyone makes it back alive. Not counting on with Astarion's group, Will chuckled. Losing the two chatterboxes had been priority number one, and not a particularly difficult one for Astarion. Turn a corner, climb the pitted face of the wall, and get back to the rafters where he could keep an eye on his tag-alongs and not have to listen to their incessant droning. Priority number two was getting back to the locked door he had seen behind Dror Ragzlin's little throne of skulls. With how prominently the door was positioned, it either held the route they sought or something a little more material in its value. He wasn't sure which he'd prefer to find, honestly. He wasn't interested in leaving the sun behind, true, But taking the risen road meant traveling with the tieflings, and lovely as they were as party guests, it would only be a matter of time before his little secret got out and torches and pitchforks came to camp. Finding the path might earn a reward, too. Dropping down cat-like before the door, Astarion first checked the hinges and locks for any obvious traps. Given the guards in the room prior, it seemed unlikely. He pressed a ruby eye to the keyhole and drew a breath out of sheer force of habit. The pile of gold and treasure he saw through that keyhole, the spoils of the army of the Absolute, was possibly more money than he'd ever seen in his life. Certainly he'd seen larger balances on paperwork. He'd issued rulings from the bench about greater sums, but actually seeing it all in one place. Astarion's fingers trembled as he heard the lock click open. The iron-banded door swung open and he lit inside, nudging the door shut behind him and turning toward the pile, eyes wide and breath uneven. His heart should be pounding, he knew, but Simon's blood kept his pulse steadier than it otherwise would have been. So much gold. With this much, I could go anywhere. I can run. You think you can run? Don't be stupid, boy. That laugh echoed in his skull, and he could feel the ghost of his commands halting his legs, paralyzing him, dragging him back. Hold very still. Oh, you're such an exquisite canvas. Astarion pushed himself from the door he was leaning against, as if to prove to himself that he could move. He could run. But what about? His mind spun off in a dozen different directions, tracing the outline of what he tried desperately not to think. But if someone tells you don't think of a Hollyphant, then what do you think of? What about Simon? His unerring source of lifeblood freely given. His gentle master, no, don't even think that horrid word. His protector, his guardian, his guide, steadfast and warm as the sunrise. The sun on his cheeks and in his raven hair looked so lovely this morning. If Astarion ran, he had to leave all of this behind. Safety, ease, comfort, as much as that could be had out here. Oh, but he held me. He fed me. All he had to do was purr like a house cat for him sometimes, and he was shielded. Visit him in the evenings, and his protection was guaranteed. Was it really so bad? Of course not. He can endure sleeping in a tent as long as he had protection from the others. From Simon? Of course it's bad. Sooner or later that debt will come due, idiot. Of course it's bad. I'm still sleeping in the dirt and have no say over where I go or what I do. Still taking orders. Still on your back for crumbs. You're manipulating that sweet, darling boy. Astarion hesitated, but began reaching for the coin. To the victor go the spoils, after all. After shoveling several fistfuls of coin into his pack, however, he slowed. Darling, if I were to, hypothetically speaking, come across a large pile of gold? He asked into the earring. Yes, Astarion, you may keep a percentage as a finder's fee, Simon answered, a little smile on his lips. Keep it reasonable, though. We do have quite a few people to keep kitted out and fed. What, we're not just splitting everything even? Karlak asked from where she stood over the chasm where Minthara's body had been dumped, easing the rope she held down little by little into the pit. Each of us has different needs, some more expensive than others. If we keep the majority of the liquid assets pooled, we can make large purchases without having to have everyone constantly in each other's debt, borrowing from one another. I'm not worried about the potions and ale. We already passed that around as needed, Karlak pouted. That's not... Well, actually, yes. We're doing the same with the gold that we do with the ale. Everyone gets some pocket money, but we'll be keeping the majority together and purchasing as needed from the pot. Oh, been ages since I heard any talk of mutual aid, Karlak said. Simon kept his mouth shut. Better she think in those terms than of taxation and doles and serfdom. Nothing down here, Will said over the earrings from his place at the bottom of the crag, the end of the rope tied around his waist. Although it looks like there's a narrow crack heading westward. Too small for anyone but Howson to fit in as a mouse. Right then, one moment, Simon said, snapping his fingers and calling forth Mortimer. The tiny winged serpent stretched his wings and yawned, his little jaw unhinging. Mortimer, I need you to be my eyes, dear. Down in this pit there's a crack. I need you to look inside. Simon knelt down to release him, and Mortimer slipped from between his fingers and plopped lightly onto the broken tiles. He kept his wings tucked close as he slithered down into the crevasse, clinging to the wall and only flying in short bursts as he maneuvered. Simon remained kneeling, eyes closed as he watched Mortimer's progress. He could see the crack Will had mentioned, and Mortimer slipped inside easily. The ground on the other side was sticky with half-dried blood, and a forest of jagged stalagmites filled his vision. Faint flutters of motion kept catching his eye, a tiny skitter on the floor. "Spider!" A drop of venom plopped from the ceiling, dripped from a fang even larger than him. "Spider!" Simon moved to snap Mortimer back to his hand, but nothing appeared. The link was broken. He was just too late. "Oh dear. Giant spiders that way," Simon remarked, looking around the room for the nearest lit brazier. "That would suggest access to the Underdark, but I have to imagine the spiders would have come up into the temple over the last day, wouldn't they? There's so much fresh meat up here." "Either way, I'm not that small," Will remarked. "Hoist me back up, please," he called to Karlak, who began pulling the rope line back up with ease. "There was a pen with giant spiders in it too, wasn't there?" Karlak remarked. "Might not be free access further down or they'd lose their creepy crawlies." "Damn, you're right," Simon sighed, throwing a handful of herbs and dust into the brazier. A flare of bluish-green flames roared for a moment before dying back and leaving a tiny, shivering, silver-winged serpent on top of the warm coals. "Come here, Mortimer, I'm sorry. Always check the ceilings, dear," he cooed, stroking the tiny snake's head and cradling him against his chest. "Looks like a bit of a dead end for us. Astarion, Shadowheart?" "Looks like Priestess Gut had some pretty lavish chambers," Shadowheart replied over the earrings. "Wait, what's that? Oh, hell's got to go!" "Now that sounds like trouble," Karlak remarked, pulling the rope faster and leaving singe marks on the hemp. "Yes, it rather does. Astarion, Gale, meet us at Gut's chapel. I think the path has been found." "Understood, although I've lost sight of Astarion," Gale replied hesitantly. "Yeah, he does that," Will said, grabbing his rapier and jogging back toward the sanctuary. The sound of dog barks, bear roars, and ogre bellows echoed unevenly off the stone crags, stretching and squeezing the sounds into a torturous, wavering melody. As the last groan repeated itself down the broken halls, Simon raised a hand to his earring. "Shadowheart? Lae'zel?" "We're here. Barely," Shadowheart panted. "Funny." Halsin's voice was soft and distant, at the edge of the earring's range. "Let me take a look at you." "We found a guard at the post. This must be the path," Lae'zel supplemented after a moment. "We're all on our way," Gale said, his pace brisk. "We can hear you," Lae'zel replied. "Your footfalls are not subtle." "We can't all be perfect, darling," Astarion tittered as they rounded the corner into what was once a lavish private chamber for the temple's high priest. Now the canopy of the bed was rotted through, the lace of spiderwebs filling the holes left by the ravages of time. Wardrobes hung with their doors open, warped by the water damage, and the priestly vestments inside reduced to rags. A private altar to Selûne had been desecrated and shoved aside, making room for the enormous effigy dedicated to the Absolute, covered in elephant tusks and melted candle wax. "Let's not dawdle," Simon said, striding past. "It's only a matter of time before someone checks that scrying eye and sends a force to investigate."
They may have done so already.
Gale, who had already begun pulling scrolls and books off of the shelves, undamaged by time and water and thus clearly preserved by magic, began shoveling them into his pack. A mosaic of moon phases decorated the floor of a further interior room, the dirty residue of draining water worn away by the footfalls of 100 goblins passing through. At the back of the room, a sophisticated locking door of mithril had been forced open and was wedged ajar with a large stone. The space was quite the tight squeeze for adventurers, but an easy passage for goblins. "Reckon I can hold the door long enough for everyone to make it through?" Karlak said, her engine revving for a moment before she grabbed the edge of the door and heaved, prying it open a few more precious inches. "Go! Go!" One after another they dove through the space, Halsin barely managing the squeeze before he, too, grabbed the edge of the door from the inside.
"Now you, Karlak,"
he grunted, gritting his teeth as he held the door open. "Such a gentleman," she grinned, hopping over the rock with ease. Beyond the fine door was a much older chamber, the back wall bricked up, only to be broken down both by the power of water and of dozens of war hammers, if the layers of debris were anything to go by. Beyond that wall was a large sinkhole, with a carefully maintained ladder leading down into haunting, glowing depths.
"That's it," Halsin nodded. "Should be a temple outpost at the bottom. A few centuries ago I claimed sanctuary there and rested before I began my climb back to the surface. It's quite a long way down."
"Then let's get started," Simon said, beginning to climb without question.
"Oh, I prepared something for your four-legged companion,"
Halsin added, pulling a very natural-looking but sturdy harness from his rustic pack.
"Dogs have difficulty with ladders."
"Oh, look at that, Scratch!" Karlak grinned, taking the harness and laying it on the ground for Scratch to step into. "You get the royal treatment."
"I'll carry him if you take my pack," Will volunteered, dropping his bag from his shoulder and beginning to navigate the dog harness.
"Oh, wish I could do it, but done," Karlak said, her pout only lasting for a moment. The ladder leading down into the depths was impossibly long. Simon felt as though he'd been climbing for hours, for days, by the time he finally reached the bottom.
"Gale," he panted into his earring, "I hope you're down here in the next 5 minutes instead of wasting with me, because we're not climbing that again."
Agreed. "Ow! Watch it!" "I will get into the bottom much faster if he does not hurry up," Lae'zel spat over the earrings. "Well, now that you mention it, what a fantastic idea." Simon heard some echoing from above, the voices entirely indistinct as distance and rough walls shredded individual words. A loud scream made itself known quite quickly, however. "Holy shit! Holy shit! That was Gale!" Karlak yelled into her earring. "Oh, fuck! Man down! Fuck! 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 Fuck!" "It's quite all right. Calm down," Gale soothed over the connection, his fluttering robes soon coming into view as he descended with the elegance and control of an ice skater, only the toes of his boots tapping the rough stone floor as he reached the bottom. "Some of us just take a different route," he said, winking at Simon and hovering. A cheerful series of chirps from above heralded the arrival of a tiny, unassuming nightingale which lit upon Gale's shoulder for a moment, before transforming in a flash into the enormous, muscled form of Halsin with a smirk.
"Indeed we do," he chuckled,
his rough hands swallowing Gale's shoulder whole for a moment before he descended the dark stone stairs into the wrought iron sanctuary below.
"Been a while since I've been down here. Looks like this place has been abandoned for some time."
"I spent plenty of time in caverns, but never all the way into the Underdark," Simon remarked. "I know what to expect, but at the same time I'm sure it's nothing like what the books say."
"Indeed. Let us be on our guard. The Underdark is beautiful, but harsh and unforgiving. As alien as the depths of the sea."
"I think it's beautiful down here," Shadowheart remarked. "The decor aside," she added, wrinkling her nose as she passed a dusty altar to Selûne. "There's such depth to the shadows, tranquility." The outpost that Halsin had described had clearly suffered under more than just the water draining from above. The iron gates were rusted, and the ground was strewn with stone debris and broken weaponry. A polished marble statue of Selûne, the only intact one they'd seen in a 10-day, stood in a central courtyard holding up an orb of gentle moonlight that reflected the current moon phase back on the surface. Shadowheart brushed past it and moved for the iron gates leading out into the Underdark, the soft blue glow of bioluminescent mushrooms and delicate, magic-infused crystals beyond filtering inside. She rattled the gate, frowning. "Astarion, can you pick the lock from this side?" she asked. "Of course, darling," Astarion said, a touch of arrogance in his scoff as he pulled out his thieves' tools. "No different than picking the lock from inside a jail cell." "Is that perhaps where you picked up such a skill?" Lae'zel asked. "Or is it common among advocates here?" "I wasn't an advocate, I was a magistrate," Astarion huffed, his words echoing off the cavern walls. He reached through the bars and began to work at the lock, frowning. "Paid my dues as an advocate as quickly as I could. Oh, shit," he muttered, pulling one hand back to reveal a broken tool. "And this one finally gave up the ghost." He sighed, holding it up for closer inspection. One of the many illustrious mages they traveled with could repair that, he was sure. But something moving in the distance caught his eye. "What's that?" Astarion asked, squinting. "What's what?" Gale echoed, half blind in the dark. "That," Astarion repeated, pointing out into the crystals and mushrooms. The sounds reached all of them before they saw it, a creaking like a ship's hull in a storm, followed by a deep, moist snap, signaled the breaking of man-sized mushroom stalks, and the pounding of 2 great cloven hooves suggested what was doing the breaking. Astarion scrambled back from the gate, lockpicks abandoned and his new short sword drawn. "Minotaur!" Halsin called. "Be ready!" "A minotaur!" Gale gasped, staff drawn but expression eager. "Ah, such noble creatures! I had the pleasure of meeting one once." "Well, you're about to again," Karlach said, axe drawn. "Steady," Simon said, though almost more to himself as the minotaur barreled into view, its battle-axe catching the glint of the ever-burning torch flames, and a great huff of breath pouring from its nose, yellow eyes focused. The serenely glowing orbs held aloft by the guano-stained statues of Selûne on either side of the gate outside flared brighter for a moment before a flash like lightning blinded them all for a moment. The hoofbeats stopped, and as their vision cleared, the form of the minotaur crumbled before them like ash, completely carbonized before even the scent of burning could reach them. Indeed, there wasn't the scent of burnt flesh that one might expect, but instead an almost humming, metallic taste in the air, hot on the tongue where motes of it touched down, but disappearing almost instantly. Simon was reminded of the feeling in his fingers when he was near the statue of Selûne in the Owlbear Cave. The power of the Moon Maiden. Simon breathed reverently, his gaze flicking up to the statue that stood in the center of their little cloistered terrace, her serene smile comforting and maternal. "She still protects this place." "She didn't protect it very well, did she?" Shadowheart scoffed, gesturing to the disarticulated skeletons that littered the ground, spear points broken off in their rotted armor. "Shows how much that witch cares." "That's not fair," Simon frowned. "This shrine might have fallen during the time of troubles." "Likely, in fact, judging by the decay," Gale piped up. "Regardless, none of us are Selûnites. I'd rather not risk receiving the same treatment as that minotaur if we start trying to enter and exit from that gate," Simon stated, looking at the deceptively peaceful moonlit glow from the orbs. "We should find another way in and out." "Why not just out?" Shadowheart asked, frowning. "We have to camp somewhere, and this is an extremely safe location," Simon stated, looking about at the heavy wooden doors inside the cloister, forced open in the past when the shrine was sacked. "Relatively speaking." "He is correct. The defenses of this place were just demonstrated. If I can put aside my disdain for your Faerun gods and accept their protection, then so can you," Lae'zel declared. "We would be foolish to sleep elsewhere."
Camping and traveling in the Underdark is always dangerous, Halsin nodded sagely. Even in this place we must still be careful of Phaserus. Clouds of wild magic that suffuse the Underdark. Those who live here are adapted to it, but creatures from the surface can succumb to madness when exposed for long periods of time. We should spend as little time down here as we can to preserve our sanity. Fan out, everyone. Secure the area, find any possible exits, Will said. Scratch whined and squirmed in his harness, and Will finally crouched down to release him. Sorry, big fella, he smiled, ruffling his fur for a moment. Didn't forget you, promise. Scratch gave a small, understanding bark before sniffing at the floor, hurrying along. Don't wander off too far, okay? Karlak called. We don't know what's down here. Another bark came in reply, and Karlak nodded. Looking for the loo, she translated, gesturing to where Scratch had darted off to. Well, we all have our tasks then, Simon said. Let's get to work. Oi, think you could find us some fresh water? Karlak called, standing over a long empty fountain, the interior dusty white from the lime scale. Gonna be hard to wash up otherwise. Oh, right. Simon nodded, moving off to a corner with his cards. He tried to maintain his outward sense of calm, to look like the leader he'd become over the past 10 days. But as he shuffled and shuffled again, his fingers dancing in well-practiced arcane gestures, reaching for the threads of the weave that felt like home, he found nothing. He hadn't mentioned to anyone the haziness, the cataract he'd felt growing over his third eye as they descended the ladder. But the harder he looked, the more inescapable the fact became. He was blind. His cards were mere paper in his hands. He couldn't hear the thoughts of his fellow travelers. The edge of his mind closest to Hadar felt nothing. Not the emptiness of a hungry stomach, the emptiness of a mouth hung open, but the emptiness of null, of undefined, of mu. For the first time in his life, Simon Whitelily was completely, utterly alone.